Looking for a new playmat or some custom sleeves? You can support Magic Untapped in the process by clicking on the affiliate link for Inked Gaming in the description. The 50th expansion in Magic: The Gathering history, Zendikar introduces not just a bunch of new cards, but a wholly new plane and story to the game as well. That story can be experienced by reading Robert B. Wintermute's novel, Zendikar, In the Teeth of Ugin, which, like with the previous Magic block, contains the entire story of not just the set of Zendikar, but of the two other sets that make up the Zendikar block as well, Worldwake and Rise of the Eldrazi. Nissa is a Jorga elf from the area of Bala Ged, a planeswalker, and therefore different from the rest of her kind. She has been exiled and resides in the company of a Tajuru elf friend of hers named Heba. The two elves head to a meeting in the home tree, where they are informed of a blight of some sort threatening the forest. Nissa is ordered by the meeting's speaker to investigate. On the way towards this blight, Nissa and Heba are attacked by vampires of the area's brood lineage. Despite her fear of vampires, Nissa dispatches them. Sensing something wrong, the duo return to the home tree, whereupon she finds numerous blood lineage vampire corpses littering the area. She ventures inside to discover many slain elves. Among the dead is the speaker. She and Heba then get word that a nearby village is being assailed by more vampires. The pair head there, with Nissa gathering allies along the way. Unfortunately, shortly after their contingent arrive, the vampires lay waste to most of them, Nissa's friend, Heba, included. Nissa herself was fated to be slain were it not for the intervention of a mysterious person. This person, a man who calls himself Sorin, easily wipes out the brutish swarm, save for one, a slave known as Anawan, who is quite obviously different from the rest. Sorin learns that the vampire is quite familiar with a region of Zendikar known as Ugin. Sorin, as it turns out, is in search of a place known as the Eye of Ugin, and recalls that it lays in Ugin, but, thanks to a spell he cast on himself, cannot quite put his finger on exactly where. He enlists Anawan as a guide in exchange for his life, and also enlists Nissa for her familiarity with the plane. Nissa agrees to accompany him on two conditions. 1. They help her bury her late friend, Heba, and 2. Sorin keeps Anawan bound due to her fear and hatred of vampires. As they travel, the trio stop to make camp from time to time. During one of these breaks, Sorin discusses about the lineage as well as the legitimacy of a mythical race known as Eldrazi. Nissa scoffs at Sorin for such foolhardy notions. Sorin, meanwhile, admonishes Nissa for thinking he is little more than a human with interesting abilities. Over the next few nights and the experiences during, Nissa begins to think differently of Sorin, thinking he may be more than human than she first thought, and maybe even a planeswalker like herself. Soon, the trio venture into an area known as Greypelt. The area appears nearly deserted as tattered tents and only a handful of people are around. Nissa leads Sorin and Anawan into one specific tent. Inside is a land-dwelling merfolk known as Khalid. He recognizes Nissa, who informs him of the two friends with whom she is traveling. Khalid retorts, saying that the two seem more chummy with one another than either does with her. He then informs her that the bound one, the one known as Anawan, is indeed a vampire. After being reassured that Anawan is safely bound, Khalid agrees to assist the trio. Nissa informs him of their destination and asks if he happens to have a map of Ugin, which the merfolk indeed does, and will give it to them for a price. Sorin offers up an orb of dark energy, but Khalid refuses due to the evilness within. Rather, he would like to have a copy of Anawan's notes about Ugin. The merfolk then tells the group that he is unsure if it is Eldrazi they're dealing with, but that all signs point towards the fabled Eye of Ugin. Before the party leaves, Khalid pulls Nissa aside to warn her that, like a parasitic plant, Eldrazi pose a real, unseen threat, and that it's best that she stays with her party despite her reservations. He also cautiously reminds her that vampires live on blood. The trait from Greypelt proves perilous. A vicious storm hits, and Nissa warns her companions that a royal is upon them. They attempt to take cover, but royals are not your average storm. Nissa is thrown against the roots of nearby foliage. Stones and hedrons, mysterious floating geometric shapes of unknown origin, begin to fall, and a piece of land that Sorin and Anawan are on begins to float. After the storm, the trio find themselves within a crevice. Anawan is unbound and questioning why Sorin is having Nissa help them. Sorin is in a daze, asking for someone named Lenice, before snapping back to reality, though is initially too weak to walk without assistance. Soon enough, things normalize for the party and they climb out of the crevice, only to find some 300 core before them, weapons drawn. The nomadic core looked a bit worse for wear. In fact, Nissa gathered that they had all seemed to be fleeing from something. Nissa extends her palms, which is a core sign of courtesy. The core hookmaster, or leader, takes the three into his audience. He explains to them that his core had recently encountered a large group of brood lineage and were fleeing eastward away from them. The group rests for the night before resuming their trek to Okum. On the way, they notice a group of goblins seemingly keeping prisoner an unkempt female core who is carrying a strange crystal as she busily mutters nonsense to herself. The core falls to her knees and begins chanting. The goblins, too, kneel and chant. Anawan, listening to the core lady's babbling, recommends that they join their traveling party. Sorin, noticing that the babbling is all in ancient Eldrazi, agrees. The core then switches her speech to ancient vampire, informing Anawan and Sorin that she, herself, is Eldrazi, and that the key is requested. The goblins find themselves afraid to speak. Sorin is intrigued. As their travels continue, they encounter many dangers, including giants, more intense royals, more of the brood lineage, and fewer goblins in their party, as they seem to be mysteriously disappearing one by one over their travel's various overnight stops. Eventually, the group enters the town of Zulaport. Sorin tells Anawan that, while they're in town, he would regret it if he tried to feed on any of the residents. The group checks into an inn and calls it a night. Nissa, though, is suddenly stirred awake by some stranger. She attacks the man and ventures outside, noticing the rest of her party seems to be absent. Soon she finds the men who had captured her traveling companions, noticing, to her chagrin, that they are all vampires. Anawan explains that they're not just vampires, but they also control the area through extortion of the weak. Apparently, 2 men of Endoril, the head vampire, were found dead, drained of their blood. Despite Anawan's claims that he didn't do it, Nissa thinks he did. Endoril begins interrogating the group. Sorin answers each question with a mocking remark. Insulted, Endoril shoves Sorin to the ground. Angered, Sorin uses his magic to reanimate one of the vampiric corpses, sending it shambling towards the vampire boss. Anawan and Nissa use this opportunity to attack Endoril's henchmen. The group ultimately win their freedom, and decide it's probably a good time to head out of town as they resume their trek towards Okum, this time by sea. While sailing, Sorin comments that, if not stopped, the Eldrazi will devour all the planes in the multiverse. To prevent this from happening, they will need to kill all of the Eldrazi brood in order to prevent the Eldrazi Titans from escaping their prison. Nissa wonders why Sorin is suddenly being so open about all this, questioning his motives. Sorin simply informs her that he will need her power and that she simply cannot decline. Finally, they reach the shores of Okum. Scaling up its cliffs and hedrons, the group soon finds themselves before Tal Terig, which is where the Eldrazi bury their dead. Sorin wants to avoid the place, but their route takes them right through the area. There, the group notices a number of brood waving their tentacles around. Samara, the mad core woman, mutters, "The Titans stir." Just then, the group is taken in by a band of elves who are on patrol. They are arrested for trespassing too close to Tal Terig. They're brought to the band's leader, who asks them if they're working in league with the brood. When nobody in the disgruntled group answers, he orders them locked away with their guide thrown out into the salt flats, and the vampire, Anawan, to simply be thrown off the tower. Now locked away, Samara, the remaining goblin, Nissa and Sorin in one cell, and Anawan in another, The group tries to think of a means of escape. Nissa tells Sorin that, despite her reservations about vampires, Anawan is the only one capable of leading them to the Eye of Ugin. That's when the goblin speaks up. Apparently, he also knows the way. Shortly thereafter, the door to their cell opens and a half-dozen elven guards enter. Sorin uses a magic spell and easily slays the guards. The goblin finds the jail key and opens their cell door before then freeing an extremely perturbed Anawan from his. Having escaped from the tower, the group continues their trek. As they travel, they join a caravan. In the protection of the caravan, Anawan and Nissa converse. The vampire says that he knows of other worlds beyond Zendikar, and that the Eldrazi come from one of those other worlds. The caravan eventually encounters a royal bloom that had been consumed by lava, hardened. The caravan see it as a sign of good fortune. Nissa, however, sees it as an abomination of nature and promptly destroys it. Pissed off at her action, the caravan exiles Nissa and her companions from their company. Once again traveling on their own, Anawan begins to get more and more edgy. He begins volunteering to take watch every night. Soon, Sorin confronts him, saying that he knows their party is being tracked by vampires, and that Anawan knows it too. Not too long after, the party is, indeed, attacked by a number of vampires and their thralls. They all fight well, but the vampires end up getting the upper hand and Nissa finds herself captured. Bound and being denied food and water by her captors, she is led through the mountains for 3 days before being allowed to collapse onto the ground. Sheer, the vampiric band's leader, informs the elf that her friends are alive, but that she is to be used as bait as they're looking to use her to lure the Mortifier into a trap. Sheer then tells Nissa that generations ago, the Mortifier sold Zendikar's vampires into servitude to the Eldrazi, thus why they're after him now that he's shown back up. Sorin and Anawan of course take the bait and arrive on scene. Sheer and his vampiric band, however, seemed a bit ill-prepared for what they'd be facing when they did arrive, as Sorin and Anawan easily handle their adversaries, Sheer taking his own life in the end, rather than allowing Sorin to take it from him. The group resumes their travels. As they venture forth, another of Zendikar's royals kicks up. Hiding from the storm, Anawan confesses to Nissa that the royals had never existed before the Eldrazi were imprisoned, and the various mysterious floating hedrons appeared across the land that same time. The vampire then theorizes that allowing the Eldrazi to escape, and thus be able to leave Zendikar, might be a good thing for the realm. Nissa retorts, saying she'd rather break off her own teeth than assist the Eldrazi, causing Anawan to storm off in a hissy. Not long after, the band arrives in a different town. While there, their goblin friend, Mudheal, mentions that there is a spirit within the crystal the crazy core woman, Samara, carries, and that the spirit wishes for the Eldrazi to be freed from their prison, which is in direct conflict with Sorin's plans. That's when Samara begins ranting and screaming, which draws a bit of a crowd around her. Sorin approaches, and Samara's rants become focused upon him. Not rants, a conversation in an ancient tongue. The two, as well as Anawan, who had also approached, argue. In the end, Samara stomps off in frustration, with Mudheal in tow. The scene calmed down, Sorin goes in search of supplies for the final stretch of their journey. Nissa and Anawan, meanwhile, chat. It seems Anawan had played guide to the Eye of Ugin before, and recently at that, to a woman with fiery hair, and a mind mage who traveled with her. He said that, while he was locked out of the Eye's chamber, the fire and mind mages somehow managed to weaken the lock on the Eldrazi's prison. Sorin then returns and tells Nissa and Anawan that the supplies they need can be found at a nearby tent. There, Nissa notices a sleeping man as they begin taking what they need. She marvels at how the man never stirred. That's when Sorin tells her to stop being so naive, as he drank him dry of blood. That's when it finally dawns on Nissa that, this whole time, she had been traveling with not just one vampire, but two. The trio then began to venture up a combe towards the Eye, trusting on Anawan's memory of the place now that they are without Mudheal and Samara. Despite occasional royals and other perils, they managed to make it up safely enough. They decide it's time for a rest, and Nissa takes the first watch, during which she smells smoke of another's campfire. She decides to investigate. Nissa spies Samara and Mudheal at their own camp. Mudheal mentions to Samara that Nissa and her companions are probably not far from the Eye at this point, and that, once they reach a fork in the road, they should take the narrower of the two paths. Nissa, seeing no reason to distrust what the goblin is saying, takes note. The following day, the trio make it to the fork that she had overheard the goblin telling of the night before. After a skirmish with some more of the brood, the group takes the trail to the right and makes their way towards the Eye, avoiding some dangerous lava drakes along the way. The trio reach a cave. On its walls are writings that even Anawan cannot decipher. Sorin chimes in and speaks of atrocities the Eldrazi have committed on other planes. That's when Mudheal pops back onto the scene. He points the way to the Eye, but warns the group that Samara is there, and antagonizing her might not be the best decision. As the group descends into the cavern, Nissa notes a scratching noise that seems to grow louder and louder the deeper they venture. Sorin tells her it's the Three Kings clawing for their escape. That's when Nissa questions him about everything he knows in regards to these Eldrazi. He tells her that Zendikar was always a wild place, even before the Eldrazi arrived. Nissa also learns that the mysterious hedrons found around the realm are full of condensed mana designed to keep the Eldrazi's prison strong. The Eldrazi can never free themselves, as the hedrons act in complete contradiction to the Eldrazi's nature. Sorin then commands that everyone stop talking as they enter a chamber with a single hedron in its center, a dragon etched upon it, and the crazy core woman, Samara, striking it over and over again in an attempt to shatter it. Sorin begins singing, which gets Samara's attention. She launches herself off the hedron and towards him. Sorin is knocked to the ground, and that's when Nissa takes off. She sprints towards the hedron and places a spell upon it. Sorin, meanwhile, gets up and slays Samara, then resumes his singing. Nissa falls to the ground, her spell spent. The hedron then cracks in two, and Sorin falls silent. He turns towards Nissa, calling her a fool, as the force she's releasing is far worse than anything he could do to her. She has unsealed her own punishment. The cavern rocks and begins to cave in. Nissa and Anawan flee as fast as they can. Looking back, Nissa sees the largest tentacle she could have ever imagined filling the fissure left behind. They reach the cave's entrance to witness the drakes they were trying to evade earlier were now flying away as fast as they could. That's when they witness three immense alien beings emerging from the ruined mountain. The Eldrazi Titans, Kozilek, Emrakul, and Ulamog. Nissa turns to Anawan, who is gazing back to her with insatiable hunger. The three Eldrazi Titans begin to make their way across the landscape, all of which seems to wilt and turn dead as they move. Sorin catches up with the duo and tells them they are at fault for everything that happens here on out. Anawan tells Sorin that he will need to accompany him back to Gruul Draz, Zendikar's vampiric homeland, to face his own justice for being the Mortifier. Sorin laughs at him, then tells Nissa that the Titans are headed towards her own home, the Turned Timber Forest. A new royal builds up, toppling a nearby mountain and distracting Anawan. Sorin gives Nissa a wink, and the two planes walk away, but not before the elf pins Anawan down and binds his hands, saying that she is done with vampires. Sorin goes one way, and Nissa another. She returns back to Bala Ged and the Jorka elves there. She and the elves set back out to where the Eldrazi Titans were, finding it nothing more than a wasteland. They plant seeds, hoping to see it thrive someday once again. Nissa then vows to find Sorin and get him and as many other planeswalkers as she can to help re-imprison the Eldrazi she had unleashed on the multiverse. And that pretty much does it for the story of the Zendikar block, though there's still much more to tell about each of the block's three sets, and that includes, of course, the block's namesake set of Zendikar.
Okay, so Zendikar started because I wanted to do an experimental year. I felt there were a lot of land-based mechanics that we could we could do a set around land-based mechanics. So one of the things that happened with this set, by the way, I was the lead designer, and Henry Stern was the lead developer, and then at some point, Devin Lowe also spent some time being the lead developer of this set. Anyway, one of the things that happened was I had this idea for this land set, and then creative was on the hook to go, well, what is this? And Doug Beyer, who was on the team, came up, and also the creative team, came up with a neat idea of it being an adventure world, kind of like a cross between Dungeons & Dragons and Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Designed as Magic the Gathering's adventure world, Zendikar is a Lands Matters set. Sure, lands matter in Magic the Gathering in general, but Zendikar made them matter in a whole new way. First off, the set features full art lands. While full art lands are nothing new to Magic as a whole, as they were previously found in Magic's humor sets Unglued and Unhinged, this would mark the first time that they would be available in a tournament legal black bordered set. Then there's the new ability word Landfall, which triggers each time a land enters play under your control, and to help players not only achieve multiple landfall triggers, but also help with some color fixing, is a cycle of brand new enemy colored fetch lands.
We know we wanted sexy lands. Development decided they wanted to bring back the fetch lands. It felt like a really good fit because the set would have a land theme. Making the other lands we hadn't made yet felt like it would, we delivered on something people had always wanted. It fit really well. Plus the fetch lands work with landfall, so it just fit perfectly.
Speaking of cycles, Zendikar features 13 of them. Some of the more notable ones, beyond the aforementioned fetch lands, include Expeditions, which is a common cycle of enchantments that get a quest counter on them as their landfall trigger. Players can then remove 3 such counters from the card for a payoff. Quests, an uncommon cycle of enchantments. Unlike Expeditions, however, each of these cards have their own trigger for adding quest counters as well as their own payoffs. Ascensions, a rare cycle of enchantments that also get quest counters and have their own specific payoffs in the end. Common spell lands, each of which come into play tapped, can tap for a single color of mana, and have an enter the battlefield trigger. Rare spell lands, each of which comes into play tapped, can tap for a single color of mana, and have their own extra ability as well. And Refuges, which are allied colored dual lands that come into play tapped, but also gain their controller 1 point of life when they hit the board. That landfall mechanic mentioned earlier is not the only new mechanic in Zendikar, by the way, as there are a few more. Intimidate, which replaces the now defunct Fear ability. It makes creatures with the ability unblockable, except for by artifact creatures and creatures that share a color with it. Ally, a creature subtype that synergizes with ally triggers, and are either beneficial for, or dependent upon, other allies in play that a player controls.
One of the things I'm always big on is I like when you can get thematic things and tie them together in your set where like multiple things care about something. And so I really like the idea of, well, landfall cares about lands coming into play. What if allies care about allies coming into play?
And Bloodied, a new ability specific to the set's vampire creature type. It provides the creature with a boost if an opponent's life total falls to 10 or less. Kicker, a returning mechanic, is also in the set. Additionally, Zendikar introduced a new card subtype called Trap. Found only on instants, trap cards have an alternate cost if a specific condition is met. The card Lava Ball Trap, for example, is an 8-costed spell, but can be cast for 3 and 2 red instead, so long as an opponent has had 2 or more lands enter the battlefield under their control during the active turn.
It's funny because Trap just came from the Raiders of the Lost Ark thing, I think. Like, I think we all were thinking of the opening scene, like, okay, what happens when this happens? And the traps, the idea of the traps were, originally your opponent knew there was a trap, but they didn't know what the trap was. The idea there was, I have a trap, but what's going to happen with my trap? And then eventually we decided that it was just easier to move it into the hand, so like, it was more of a, you just didn't know it was coming. I mean, maybe you read your opponent, but you didn't, it wasn't as obvious as the version we had was like, look, a trap in play.
As far as individual cards go, Zendikar boasts a nice selection of powerful and popular selections. Archive Trap, an instant that can be cast for free if an opponent has searched their library at some point during the active turn. It is a very popular inclusion in competitive mill decks. Bloodghast, a vampire that saw widespread competitive play, thanks to its built-in recursion via landfall. Philidar Sovereign, an alternate win condition card. Goblin Guide, a terrific turn 1 play for red aggro decks despite its downside. Iona, Shield of Emeria, which is used as a lock and finisher card in some legacy decks, as well as in standard and modern reanimator decks. Punishing Fire, a red direct damage spell that has found itself banned in modern since 2011, thanks to its loop-encouraging synergy with the land Grove of the Burnwillows. Spreading Seas, which is found not only in Merfolk tribal decks, but also sometimes in tournament-level decks as an answer to various non-basic lands. Valakut, the Molten Pinnacle, a direct damage land that can be a finisher in Scapeshift and Amulet Titan decks in Modern. Vampire Hexmage, which is a key component in Legacy Depths decks. And Warren Instigator, the card was, at one time, banned and extended, and can sometimes still today be found in Goblin tribal decks. Zendikar also introduced to the game a few new Planeswalker cards in Nissa Ravane, Sorin Markov, and Chandra Ablaze, which is the first new version of Chandra since her debut card in Lorwyn. And those who attended the Zendikar pre-release were treated to a foil alternate art promo version of the card Rampaging Baloths, as well as a Celestine Reef Plane card that goes with the then recently released Plane Chase Ancillary set. Its release promo card, given to game day event participants, was a foil alternate art Valakut. But even beyond all that, Zendikar had one more thing in store for players: Priceless Treasures. Remember how we said that the plane of Zendikar is the adventure world plane? Well, what's an adventure without some treasure to find? Found only in the original print run of Zendikar, Priceless Treasures is a set of rare and expensive older cards which were inserted randomly into booster packs. In short, Wizards of the Coast obtained existing, hard-to-find cards from Magic the Gathering's early days and snuck them into a small percentage of packs for players to discover, like buried treasure. These cards ran the gamut from the game's original Power 9, like Black Lotus and Time Walk, to original dual lands like Bayou and Tundra, to reserve list cards like Eureka and Mox Diamond, to other older notable cards such as Berserk and Sinkhole. And because these cards were original printings rather than reprints, their inclusion in Zendikar booster packs did not violate Wizards of the Coast's reserved, or do not reprint, list.
Are you sure it's legal? Of course it's legal.
So is Zendikar one of your favorite Magic the Gathering sets? Love it or hate it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you would like to support Magic Untapped, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, we have a tip jar on Patreon if you're feeling so generous. Thank you for watching.